Hello everybody, this is Almir. It's geek time again. It's time for another episode of Hanging Out with a Software Engineer. Today's topic is going to be about something specific about microservices and the database choice and the type of database that you can pick. Basically, the topic is NoSQL or relational database for your microservice. How do you know when to pick which one, or is NoSQL always the right solution? Is the relational always the right solution? So let's talk about it. When you're designing your microservice, if you're first time in the land of microservices and you want to discipline yourself and design microservices that are single purpose, it's probably better to start with using a NoSQL database and using the code first approach and code first mentality, meaning that you design your functionality in the microservice, you design your models or model classes in your code, and then you decide how you will save that information, and you use database truly as a repository place without having any logic or any store procedures. So the way to do it is you pick the NoSQL database. For example, let's use Dynamo DB. So you decide what type of data you will save into that table. You decide what the primary key is, what the sort key is, and then you have some searching capabilities here and some indexes you can define in order to help with the searches. But at the end of the day, the logic on how the data is stored and the structure of the data resides in the microservice code itself. That way, with this approach, having a single purpose microservice, what it's supposed to be, having a dedicated table for that microservice without having a chance of somebody else using the table that's dedicated for your microservice, probably using the NoSQL database is a good way to kind of train yourself on how to develop microservices. But now the question is the NoSQL database a good choice if you're already an expert in designing and developing microservices? Do you need NoSQL database? And when do you actually need the relational database? I'll give you examples. If your microservice is used for real-time processing and event-driven architecture, where requests are coming in, you're saving data based on the primary key, or you're pulling data or searching data based on a primary key, or maybe slightly more complicated searches where you're searching on data based on some filter expressions using primary key, or you create some indexes on your NoSQL table and then you're searching based on those indexes. But the question comes is that how much data will come back in this search? If your search results are within a few megabytes, then you can tolerate a NoSQL database. But let's say you had a case where you need to search and you need to get thousands of records back in this search. Is the NoSQL database the right choice here, and how well will it perform? I'll give you some statistics based on the prototype I did with Dynamo DB. For example, if you want to search or scan the Dynamo DB table and it happens to be returning back 5,000 records, then basically it's going to take you 1.4 minutes. For example, in Dynamo, if you want to query or scan a Dynamo table and that query happens to return back 10,000 records, it's going to take you 2.8 minutes to get that data back. With Dynamo DB, there's a limitation with 1 megabyte in a single result, then you have to constantly be looping and getting the remainder of your result. So 10,000 records is 2.8 minutes. For 100,000 records, it's going to take you 28 minutes to get those results back. And for 1 million records, it will take you 4.7 hours roughly. Yes, with Dynamo DB, you can provision your reads on this table to a higher number at the time when you're doing these searches, and then you can lower this. But keep in mind that this table is still being used by your real-time customers, whereas this query that you want to do may be only used by a few customer service agents who need to query some information, or maybe some other utility that requires you to extract information out of this table and generate a file and send that file to a third party for some extra processing. Is the NoSQL database here the right choice? Does this microservice, or is this microservice going to work with a NoSQL table like this, or do you need a relational database? It basically boils down to how much you need to query your table. In this case, I mentioned maybe you need every week you need to extract all 1 million records out of this table, or a couple of million records out of this table, generate a file, send it to some third party, and maybe this third party is not capable of having an API driven communication. They expect a file, they need to process that file, and they need to give you that file back that you then later you can insert into a table. So is the NoSQL or Dynamo DB in this case the right choice? It will take you 4.7 hours just to extract 1 million records, whereas if you pick the relational database with stored procedure queries, it's going to take you seconds or minutes to query 1 million records. So now you have to decide where you have to use the right tool for the job. If your microservices are only doing searches on primary keys and sort key, or you're inserting data, then NoSQL database or NoSQL table like Dynamo DB would in AWS platform would help you. But if you have a need to extract all the data out of your table on regular basis, and this table has thousands or millions of records, then using Dynamo DB for number one, it's going to take you a long time to extract. Number two, you're impacting the reads on that table while somebody else or the end customers are using the microservice and getting the data out of that table. So you're basically sharing resources here for something that maybe you need to do once a week or every night. That's basically where I tell people, if you have this type of situation, design your microservice. Still use the code first approach, where microservice contains the logic. Store procedure happens to be just a proxy to database, and store procedure should not contain much logic, or it should not contain any logic. Especially when you're saving information into the table, store procedure should just proxy that data and write it into a relational database. For example, if you're on an AWS platform, you could use Amazon Aurora as your relational database, because it is managed to some degree. With Amazon Aurora, you don't have to watch about reads and writes per second the way you have to do it for Dynamo DB, but there is the storage considerations you have to take into account when you are designing Amazon Aurora tables. Basically, to recap, if you're designing a microservice that only accesses the database by primary key or sort key, then you can use a NoSQL database, in this case, for example, Dynamo, if you're on AWS platform. But if you're required, besides doing a real-time processing and then customers writing and pulling data by primary ID, if you on daily basis or weekly basis need to extract a lot of data out of this table for some batch processing, NoSQL will not do it for you. So you have to think about this from the beginning, because if you already designed a table with NoSQL, if you already designed a NoSQL table and your microservice is using NoSQL table, and then later you realize you need it for batch processing, it's going to take you a long time to migrate this information into some relational table that your microservice sits on top of. You will have to consider that migration process if you didn't make the right decision at the beginning. Basically, the conclusion is, pick the right tool for the job. So NoSQL has its place, relational database has its place. If you're starting with microservice architecture and you have never done it before, NoSQL database is really a good way to enforce the discipline on having a single purpose microservice, having a database table that's dedicated for that microservice. If you start with relational database and you've never done microservice architecture before, the old habits will take over here, where you will start designing this database schema, and then you will wrap it with an API or a microservice, but you may not arrive at a single purpose microservice. This microservice may end up having multiple purposes, because the concept of microservices is to have a true RESTful API routes. If you find yourself that your microservice does not have a RESTful API routes, that it's turning into an RPC type of a service with the RPC type of routes, then it means that this is not a microservice. I'm not saying that microservice is the right way to go. Maybe you will be fine with having a macro service, but you should not be calling it a microservice. It's just a service that happens to wrap a database schema, and you expose API routes on top of it. So those are the things that you have to consider when picking the right database for the job. Thank you for watching. If you like my videos, please click the thumbs up button. If you don't like my videos, you can always click the thumbs down button. And I'll see you in the next episode. Keep geeking out.